Today we're going to be multiplying fractions and whole numbers using standard algorithm. Last week we talked about multiplying a whole number and a fraction, or a fraction and a whole number. There were several different ways we talked about we could do this. When we start with a whole number, we can think about it as equal groups. So when I am saying 5 times 1/2, what I can do is I want to have 5 different groups. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. And I want to shade in 1/2 of each group. So I would cut each of my groups into 2 parts because my denominator is 2. And then I would shade in 1/2 of each group. So now what I can do is I can count how many halves I have shaded in. So right now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 halves shaded. Now 5 halves is an improper fraction, and we don't want to leave improper fractions as our answer to this equation. So what I can do is I can ask myself, how many times does 2 go into 5? Well, we know it goes 2 times, and we had 1 left over. So that 1 left over will be my numerator, and I'm going to keep the same denominator. So 5 times 1/2 equals 5 halves, or 2 1/2. In this example, we're going to start with the fraction first. We're going to say 1/2 times 6. So what we can do here is we can represent 6 wholes. So let me draw 6 wholes. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wholes. And my fraction 1/2 has a denominator of 2. So I know I want to split my 6 wholes into 2 groups. Now, I have to think about my basic facts. If I have 6 wholes and I want to break them into 2 groups, how many would be in each group? Well, we know that 6 divided by 2 equals 3. So I want to put 3 wholes in each group. And going back to my numerator in my fraction, my numerator is a 1. So I know that I'm looking for 1 group out of 2. So this group is my 1 group out of 2, or my 1/2. And when I go back to look and see how many wholes I have in that group, I have 1, 2, 3. So 1/2 times 6 equals 3. We can use our representations to help us solve these problems, but we also can use standard algorithm to solve the problems as well. Now, the first thing we need to talk about before we can solve using standard algorithm is the fact that we cannot multiply a whole number and a fraction together in this form. We cannot say 5 times 1/2 when we're using standard algorithm. So what we want to do is we need to take this 5 and we need to turn him into a fraction. What we can do to turn this 5 into a fraction is we can turn this 5 wholes into 1/2 pieces. So I'm going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wholes, and I want to see how many 1/2 size pieces there are in 5 wholes. So count my halves with me. 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, 7 halves, 8 halves, 9 halves, and 10 halves. So I know that there are 10 halves in 5 wholes. Now looking at 10 over 2, or 10 halves, I can simplify that fraction because I know that 2 goes into 2 and 10. So I can say divided by 2 over 2. This is simplifying that we've been working on. And 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So this is the number 5 as a fraction. So what we can do is we can just take our 5 and we can change it into a 5 over 1. And now it is in the form of a fraction. And you can do this with any whole number in your equations that you come across. If you need to make them into a fraction, you just simply take that whole number and put it over a 1, and that turns it into a fraction. So we said that we could rename our 5 as 5 over 1, and now we would be able to multiply our whole number times our fraction. You guys are going to love this. It is so much easier than adding and subtracting fractions. When we multiply fractions, we simply take the numerator times the numerator. 5 times 1 is 5. And then we take the denominator times the denominator, and that equals 2, and that is my new denominator. And if you'll recall, back when we were doing the representation for 5 times 1/2, we said that we don't want to leave 5 halves as our final answer. So we can convert that 5 halves into a mixed number. And one strategy we have for that is we can take the numerator and divide it by the denominator. 2 goes into 5 2 times. 2 times 2 is 4. Subtract and I get 1. And then we call this the clock method. We start in the quotient, we come around to the remainder and up to the divisor to make our mixed number. So when I start with my quotient, I have 2 and 1/2. So 5 halves is also equal to 2 and 1/2. Let's look at one more example. Let's look at 4 times 2/3. Now, we said that you cannot take a whole number and multiply it by a fraction. We have to take that whole number and convert it into a fraction first. And we did that by putting the whole number over a 1, and then we can multiply times 2/3. So again, our steps are we multiply the numerator times the numerator, that equals 8. And our denominator times our denominator, 1 times 3 equals 3. And again, we want to convert that improper fraction into a mixed number. So I can say 8 divided by 3. 3 goes into 8 2 times. 2 times 8 is 6. And when I subtract, I have 2 left over. So we want to start in the quotient and go around like our clock. 2 and 2/3. The whole number 2 and 2/3.